What happens when the most desired eligible bachelor in the kingdom of Aveleria falls for a quiet librarian from Virginia? Because Duke Feso could have anyone, and honestly, he did. Royal socialites, models, actresses, women who strategically attended charity galas just to accidentally end up with him in photographs. And unfortunately for the palace public relations team, there were so many rumors attached to his name that even he had lost track. But then he met Moya McGee. She was quiet, brilliant, unimpressed, a woman more interested in philosophy, library funding, and preserving community history than royal titles or designer gifts. And for the first time in Duke Feso's very privileged life, charm stopped working. Welcome back to Christmas in Old Towne Love Stories, where ambitious women, holiday love, and completely inconvenient feelings collide. If you love wealthy romance, slow burn chemistry, and emotionally confused royals, then this story is for you. Now grab your tea, get comfortable, and let's head to Petersburg. As master of ceremonies for the Kingdom of Aveleria, an oil-rich European monarchy famous for obscene levels of luxury, Fesojaye, lovingly nicknamed Feso, was responsible for entertaining foreign dignitaries, diplomats, celebrities, athletes, and billionaires visiting the country. Which meant if someone important landed in Montaloon, the capital of Aveleria, the Duke was usually somewhere nearby making sure they experienced the greatest night of their lives. He was exceptionally good at his job. The parties were legendary. Crystal chandeliers, private orchestras, champagne towers cascading beneath gold ceilings, professional athletes, international DJs, models draped across velvet furniture like modern art installations. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, usually with a glass of expensive bourbon in one hand and a dangerously charming smile on his face, was Duke Feso. A man so desired that half the women in Aveleria thought they were going to marry him, and the other half thought they could change him. He had grown up in Aveleria alongside Prince Soren. His father was the Queen's brother, who had moved from Nigeria with his wife when his sister married into the royal family. Like Soren, Feso grew up entirely in the public eye, and for better or worse, that was the only life he had ever known. Even tonight, cameras flashed constantly inside one of his most exclusive rooftop clubs overlooking the glowing skyline of Aveleria. The music pulsed through the crowd beneath golden light. Wealthy guests danced like nothing in the world could touch them. And upstairs, international K-pop superstar Juwon was performing a private set for invited guests only, which explained why half the women in Aveleria were suddenly, and violently, K-pop stans. Later, in one of the velvet-lined private booths, Mimi sat tucked beside him under dim lighting. His arm rested loosely but unmistakably protectively across her lap. "You good?" she asked softly. Juwon nodded once. "Better now." Mimi smiled immediately. "Boy, please, you out here fine for no reason." That made him laugh under his breath. Then he leaned in and kissed her, not rushed, like no one else was there, just deep enough to make the entire room disappear for a moment. And for this extremely private, image-controlled celebrity, this was a very big deal. A declaration of love. Hey loves, if you don't know how extroverted Mimi and introverted superstar Juwon fell for each other, please check out the link in the description. It's swoon-worthy. Now, let's get back to this Playboy. Do you think he'll remain that way, or will someone snatch his heart? Leave a comment and thanks for listening. We appreciate you. Now back to the story. Nearby, several women openly stared at Feso while pretending they were. One nearly walked directly into a server because she was too busy watching him laugh at something Ibrahim said. "Girl," another whispered, checking her lipstick in her phone camera, "that man really be doing anything." And honestly, she wasn't wrong. Because one thing about Duke Feso, if he wanted something, he usually got it. Luxury cars, private islands, exclusive clubs. Athletic championships, because he'd once played on national-level teams, and of course beautiful women. None of it required effort anymore, and that was the problem. Hours later, the party finally ended. The music faded. The guests spilled out laughing into waiting cars. Photographers packed up their equipment. Juwon and Mimi slipped out together before the paparazzi could catch them, and slowly, silence settled over the vast penthouse above the club. Feso loosened the collar of his black shirt as he walked alone toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline of Aveleria. Beautiful. Expensive. Restless. When no one was watching, his expression changed. just slightly, because eventually, every party ended, and lately, the silence afterward had started to feel louder than the music. A short while later, one of his assistants entered cautiously with tomorrow's itinerary. Your Grace! Feso didn't look up immediately. Yes, Prince Soren would like to see you in the morning regarding the New York diplomatic meetings. Fine. A pause. Also, there are 2 women downstairs asking if you're still receiving guests tonight. Feso turned a page in the book resting in his hands. No. The assistant blinked. No, Your Grace, but you usually. Tell them thank you for coming. A beat. The assistant hesitated, as if recalibrating his entire understanding of reality, then nodded and left. And just like that, the infamous Duke of Montaloon spent the rest of his night alone, reading philosophy, in absolute silence. The next morning, sunlight poured across the royal breakfast room inside Avaleria's palace, while Prince Soren reviewed diplomatic briefing documents for an upcoming trip to New York. Across from him, Mel sat curled comfortably in one of the oversized chairs wearing one of his sweaters while scrolling through event renderings on her tablet and occasionally stealing pieces of fruit directly from his plate, which technically was hers now, too. You're stealing again, Soren observed calmly, wiping off his black cashmere sweater. Mel popped another strawberry into her mouth. Your country literally has castles. You'll survive. Nearby, Ingrid quietly organized schedules while pretending not to listen. The doors opened moments later, and Duke Feso entered wearing all-black pajama-style silk suit. Mel glanced up immediately. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Feso paused. Good morning to you, too. No, seriously, Mel continued dramatically. Do y'all coordinate this? Because every time either one of you walk into a room, it's giving Billionaire vampire conference. Even Ingrid laughed softly. Feso dropped into a chair. Why am I here? Soren finally looked up from the documents. Because I leave for New York tomorrow. Mel immediately frowned a little. Soren noticed instantly. And then Petersburg afterward, he continued more gently. Now Mel frowned harder. You're still trying to convince me to go? Yes. Soren, besides the kidnapping, you haven't been away from me since the wedding. Mel tried not to smile at that. Unfortunately, she failed. Feso immediately looked disgusted. Here we go, he said. You can come too, Soren replied dryly. I would rather wrestle Ibrahim. From nearby, Ibrahim looked up calmly. You would lose. Mel burst into laughter. Soren ignored all of them, still watching his wife. Come with me. Mel sighed softly now. And that's when Feso noticed something shift, because Mel actually looked disappointed. I really can't, she admitted quietly. We're behind on preparations here. For what? Mel immediately pointed at him. Don't you have a trip to plan for? Soren narrowed his eyes slightly. Ingrid. Ingrid looked up innocently. Yes, Your Highness. What preparations? She held a straight face. Administrative preparations. Mel quickly nodded. Yeah, administrative. Soren stared at both of them suspiciously. Feso smirked immediately. Oh, something definitely happening. Mel waved both hands dramatically. Nothing is happening. You're a terrible liar, Soren said. Maybe I just don't like being interrogated during breakfast. You hate being separated from me. Mel looked at him for a long second. That's true. And then somehow she was in his lap and he was kissing her. The room collectively became uncomfortable for approximately 3 seconds. Then Feso stood abruptly. Nothing more sickening than being around newlyweds. Mel burst out laughing again and then got up. Soren leaned back in his chair with a quiet sigh. You're really staying. Mel reached over gently and smoothed out his sweater. It's 2 weeks, baby. That softened him instantly, which of course annoyed Feso even more. Absolutely disgusting, he muttered. Mel grinned wickedly. Meanwhile, you go home alone every night to read philosophy and ignore baddies. Feso looked offended. Watch it, you've only been a princess a few months. You literally left your own party early last night. That was different. How? He paused, then answered honestly for once. I was tired. Mel studied him carefully now, not teasing anymore, because beneath all the parties and headlines, Feso had seemed restless lately. Even Soren noticed it, which was exactly why he said calmly, You should come with me. Feso sighed heavily. I don't want to spend 2 weeks charming diplomats. You won't. Soren closed his laptop in front of him. You'll mostly be in Petersburg. Doing what? Vibing with librarians. Mel nearly screamed laughing. Feso stared at him. What does that even mean? Soren shrugged calmly. Mel's father requested a meeting about the library restoration. Ingrid joined in. We've added the Petersburg Library to Avaleria's Cultural Preservation Fund. Feso laughed. Since when have you cared about libraries? Mel pointed dramatically. Since he learned my father is the library director for Petersburg. Soren chuckled. The Kingdom of Aveleria values cultural preservation. That's cap, Feso laughed. You're renovating that library to suck up to her daddy. Soren remained perfectly composed, partly. Even Ingrid snorted quietly at that. Feso shook his head once before standing. Fine, I'll go. Mel blinked, that's it. I already packed. You want to get closer to daddy-in-law? Well, loosening up folks is what I do. Soren looked unsurprised. You assumed he'd agree, Mel asked. No, Soren replied calmly. I assumed eventually he would become tired of hearing himself complain about boredom. We leave in the morning. The New York meetings went exactly how Prince Soren expected. Long and strategic. There were diplomatic dinners overlooking Manhattan skylines, endless handshakes between investors and government officials, and several conversations where wealthy men used the phrase, global initiative, so many times it almost stopped sounding like real words. Feso handled all of it flawlessly, of course, charming when necessary, untouchable when needed, effortlessly polished beneath custom suits and international attention. Women stared, executives lingered. One billionaire's daughter conveniently, accidentally, sat beside him during dinner 3 separate times, and through all of it, Feso mostly looked bored. By the 3rd day, even Soren noticed it, as he observed quietly during one late dinner meeting. He snapped his fingers, earth to Feso. Soren joked. Feso took a sip of sparkling water. They've been discussing international shipping routes for 40 minutes. By the time the royal convoy finally arrived in Petersburg, the slower pace felt almost medicinal. Petersburg, Virginia may have been significantly less glamorous than Montaloon, but for this group that was part of its charm. There were no paparazzi waiting outside buildings, no luxury yachts drifting across harbors, no photographers hiding outside restaurants hopping to catch celebrities leaving together. Instead, there were brick sidewalks, locally owned coffee shops, historic buildings, college students crossing the street with backpacks, and people who still waved at strangers from front porches. Feso noticed all of this quietly from the backseat of the SUV beside Soren, Musa, and Ibrahim. It's quiet, he observed. Soren glanced out the window calmly. That's why Mel likes it. The Duke leaned back slightly. I understand that. In front of them, Brianna and Grant Calloway's large Virginia ranch-style home sat across rolling acres just outside the city. Grant was already waiting outside when the vehicles pulled up. The bros are here, he shouted immediately. Before anyone could fully step out of the SUVs, Pancake came flying across the yard like an emotional support missile. Oh no, Ibrahim muttered. Too late. The Golden Border Collie launched directly into Ibrahim's chest with dramatic betrayal after apparently surviving several months without him. Pancake is saying, you abandoned me, Grant translated in an unserious dog accent. I was gone for a few months, Ibrahim replied calmly while Pancake aggressively licked his face. To him, Brianna laughed softly, it felt like a military deployment. And before anyone could recover from that chaos, the front door swung open. Well, finally, Mrs. Anderson yelled from the porch. I know all you big men are hungry. Everyone immediately turned. Mrs. Anderson stood there in an apron holding a wooden spoon like a weapon. At nearly 80 years old, she still ran most of the daily operations around the ranch completely by choice. And according to Grant, fear. Mrs. Anderson, Grant warned carefully, they literally just got here. And, she replied, giants gotta eat. Musa immediately smiled. See, she understands me. Mrs. Anderson pointed directly at him and Ibrahim. You two especially. Last time I saw y'all, I thought we needed to buy another farm to feed you. Ibrahim almost smiled at that. Inside the house, warmth hit instantly, the smell of food. New Orleans jazz somewhere in the kitchen, fresh bread, laughter, large windows overlooking horse pastures. It felt lived in, not curated, not staged, not royal. Just real. By the next morning, Prince Soren was knee-deep in preparations for the meeting. Just then his phone rang. It was Edward on FaceTime, Your Highness. My guy, did you email the doc from our remodel fund? Edward nodded. AI edited some of them. Soren rubbed his temple. You didn't double-check it yourself. From down the hall, Feso walked past just in time to laugh a little. With respect, cousin, he's a librarian. I haven't even seen you crashing out like this over a head of state. Soren sighed. A few hours later, the Petersburg Public Library conference room carried a steady, intentional quiet. Prince Soren stood near the head of the table when the door opened again, and the mayor stepped in alongside Maeve. She was the mayor's top assistant and one of Mel's closest besties. Your Highness, the mayor greeted warmly, shaking his hand a little too long. The mayor had a penchant for beautiful men, and now that the room was filled with them, she didn't know what to do with herself. Welcome back to Petersburg, she cooed. Maeve cleared her throat. Soren laughed. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Maeve gave Soren a quick hug before quickly jumping into professional mode. Let's get to business. Mr. McCormick entered. The room subtly shifted, not tense, just respectful. After all, Mel's dad had been the library director for 40 years. Soren turned immediately. Mr. McCormick! The older man nodded once. Your Highness! Then, after a pause, Soren. The use of his first name landed softly but firmly. Soren straightened slightly. Yes, sir. McCormick studied him a moment. He cracked a smile. Mel treating you well. A few subtle reactions rippled through the room. Soren smiled faintly. Yes, very well. Good, McCormick said before adding, how was breakfast at the Callaways? I hear Mrs. Anderson can really burn. Soren straightened slightly, pleasantly surprised to be addressed directly. Very good, actually. Homemade biscuits, eggs, sausage, he said warmly. Mrs. Anderson mentioned wanting to make crab omelets, but unfortunately there wasn't enough crab. Grant and Brianna exchanged amused smiles. Mr. McCormick gave a slow nod. You ever been crabbing before, Prince? Soren blinked once. I haven't. McCormick leaned back in his chair. That's about what I figured. The room went quiet for half a second, then, might need to get your hands a little dirty before you leave Virginia. Brianna immediately turned her head to smile. Grant snorted. Even the mayor laughed under her breath. Soren, trying to maintain dignity, nodded seriously. I'm open to it. Mr. McCormick just stared at him. Maeve leaned toward Brianna and whispered with a grin, I like Mr. McCormick, plays no games. Brianna whispered back, this is his love language. The door opened again, and everything in the room recalibrated. Moya stepped in last, not late, intentional, cream blouse. She was gorgeous but intentionally played that down. Long plaid skirt, hair in a bun, clean makeup, calm presence. She stopped beside Mr. McCormick. This is my assistant director, he said simply. Moya, she nodded politely. Good afternoon. I had to make a quick stop at Johnny's Coffee. Then she placed a large piping hot carafe and paper cups on the table. The group nodded thanks and started pouring. Then she looked up and saw Feso. A pause, not dramatic but undeniable. Something subtle shifted in her expression, acknowledgement more than surprise. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Then she spoke, voice steady. I can walk through the renovation requirements if that's helpful. Brianna immediately nodded. Please. Moya, who usually did not enjoy speaking in front of large groups, did not mind this small one. She started her presentation. We'll need to preserve the original reading hall structure, but reinforce the eastern wing for programming capacity. Her tone was precise, quietly authoritative. Feso watched her speak like the room had dimmed around her. Across the table, Soren leaned slightly toward Maeve. Is Mr. McCormick always like this? Maeve didn't look up. Stoic. Yup. Moya continued, going to the next slide. We want murals by local artists in each section. Like for the fantasy wing, the wall will say, a reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who never reads lives only one. Feso responded instantly. George R.R. Martin. Moya looked up surprised. I see someone has read the Song of Ice and Fire series. Feso smiled. Game of Thrones all day, just call me a blurred. The group began to laugh, but something in Moya starting warming up. Later, laptops closed, chairs shifted. The formal part of the meeting naturally dissolved. Mr. McCormick asked Soren, will you be here a while? About a week and a half, Soren replied. McCormick nodded once, good. Then after a pause, since tomorrow's my day off, I'm going crabbing. It's the start of the season. A beat. Soren blinked slightly. Tomorrow. McCormick nodded like this was obvious international policy. Out on the water, early, tide's right. He looked at Soren for a moment. Wanna come? A pause. Soren didn't hesitate, sure. McCormick nodded once, good. Then, as if the matter was already settled, he turned away. Grant leaned toward Musa. The approval process has begun for that man. Musa cracked a smile. From across the room, Feso watched the exchange quietly. then glanced briefly toward Moya again. She was gathering her notes, focused, composed. Unaware of how much attention she was unintentionally holding, Feso walked over to her. "I'll be here tomorrow," he said smoothly. "For research purposes, of course. I host the best parties in all of Aveleria. Perhaps I can throw the best library grand opening too." She looked at him like he'd said something mildly concerning. "Oh," she said softly, "so you party quite a bit." For the first time in his life, Feso was nervous answering a question. Just for work." That made her smile, just enough to disrupt him because he could not tell if it was with him or at him. She gathered her things and walked toward the door. Her scent lingered behind her, something clean, subtle, and completely distracting. Feso watched her say goodbye to Mr. McCormick, the mayor, and Soren before disappearing down the hallway. He just stood there. And for the first time since arriving in Petersburg, Feso realized something unsettlingly simple. He wasn't bored here. Not even a little. The next morning in Petersburg moved at a slower rhythm than anything Feso was used to. Even the sunlight felt unhurried. Somewhere out near the ranch, Grant was already fussing at Pancake about boundaries again, while Mrs. Anderson loudly declared that anyone leaving the house without breakfast was choosing violence. Feso left anyway, not because he was hungry. He told himself it was about the renovation. It absolutely was not. By the time he arrived at the Petersburg Public Library, the building was already awake, quietly alive, doors open, staff moving softly between shelves, the faint sound of pages turning like breath. Moya was standing behind the reference desk when he walked in. She looked up. A pause. "You're early," she said gently. "We just opened." Feso nodded once. "I wasn't sure how librarians take their coffee, but here's how we make it in Aveleria." He handed her the cup. She smiled before she could stop herself and took a sip. It was annoyingly perfect. Moya studied him carefully for a moment before adding softly, "Thank you. But you didn't have to come here today. We're still a long way from any grand opening prep." "I know," he said, and somehow that felt like more than enough. He didn't leave. Instead, he wandered through the library slowly, initially under the excuse of understanding renovation flow, though no one had actually asked him to do that. But then he began reading books from different genres. Moya noticed. Of course she did. They casually and naturally spoke about everything from politics to art to the sciences to tech. Whatever point she brought up, Feso had an answer, and vice versa. Both were opinionated, him loud, her quiet, both equally intense. Soren said, "I haven't had a conversation like this, probably never." Moya blushed because even though she didn't say it out loud, the same was true for her. Much later that day she said to him, "You're in the architecture section again," she observed, passing behind him with a stack of returned books. Feso glanced down at the open book in his hands. "I'm into structural history." Then he glanced at her slowly enough to make sure she understood the point. "I enjoy studying how beautiful things are built." That earned him a look. Moya tilted her head slightly, fighting a smile before walking away. Feso watched her disappear between the shelves and thought, she's disciplined, careful. He couldn't tell, but she was completely amused. Later that afternoon, Moya led a small planning session with 2 staff members about upcoming reading programs for the winter season. Feso sat quietly in the back, not officially part of anything, just there, listening. At one point, his phone buzzed repeatedly against the table, then again, and again. Names from back home flashed across the screen. Socialites, influencers, women who normally held his attention for far too long. Without even checking the messages, he turned the phone on silent and slid it face down beside him. His attention was elsewhere, on her. He watched the way Moya moved, quiet but confident, never performative, never trying to impress anyone, and somehow that impressed him more than anyone had in years. When the meeting ended and the staff drifted away, Moya gathered her notes slowly before looking over at him. "You're still here," she said softly. "Yes." A pause. "Why?" That was the question. It lingered between them just long enough to matter. Feso considered it honestly, then smiled slightly. "I'm not sure yet." That made her still for a moment, not uncomfortable, just aware. Moya looked down at the stack of books beside her before pulling one free. "Well," she said quietly, "if you're going to stay here all week, you might as well read something worthwhile. This is my favorite book right now." She handed it to him. Feso glanced at the cover. "Taji Saladin." Her eyes lifted immediately. "You know him?" Feso nodded once. "The neuroscientist. He's a brilliant writer. Provocative," he said. "Sharp in a way that makes people uncomfortable. I haven't read this one yet, though." He flipped the book over lightly in his hands. I heard he's become a recluse recently. Moya exhaled softly. Yes, supposedly disappointed by world leaders. A faint smile crossed her face. I've wanted him to do a signing here for years, but apparently he's impossible to reach. Something unreadable flickered across Feso's expression at that. I understand the feeling, he said quietly. Then she handed him the book. Light reading, he joked as he took the book. Their fingers brushed, just briefly, but the heat of it surprised both of them. Moya looked away first, suddenly very interested in reorganizing papers that did not need reorganizing. And for the first time that day, Feso smiled without trying to charm anyone at all. A little over an hour away in Yorktown, Virginia, Soren and Mr. McCormick were already out on the water. Morning light stretched endlessly across the bay. Soren was dressed like he was headed to a luxury coastal photo shoot, boat shoes that had clearly never touched actual water. Next to him, Mr. McCormick looked like a man who'd been born on a dock and planned to die judging people from one. Without ceremony, he handed Soren a crab net. Simple, McCormick said. To Soren, it did not look simple. You tie it like that, you'll lose the catch. Soren adjusted it immediately. I see. No, McCormick replied dryly. You don't, but you will. That finally got Soren laughing. Crabbing turned out to be messy, awkward, and completely outside of his world. He dropped traps, misread instructions, nearly lost a bucket. At one point, a very aggressive seagull stole part of his sandwich directly out of his hand while Mr. McCormick watched without helping at all. But slowly, McCormick softened, because Soren was trying, badly, but genuinely. And by the end of the morning, Mr. McCormick actually laughed. Not polite laughter, real laughter. Reluctantly, McCormick glanced over and said, You don't give up easily, do you? Soren processed the statement like it was the highest praise he'd ever received. No, sir, he said honestly. I don't. McCormick was quiet for a moment. Then finally, You're good for my daughter, not the whole prince thing. You, the person, you're good for her. Soren looked up, genuinely surprised. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. McCormick nodded once. My Mel's a hard worker, takes on too much sometimes. Soren smiled faintly. I've noticed. She gets that from her mother, Mr. McCormick smirked. Soren chuckled, then another quiet stretch passed between them before McCormick added, You two'll be all right. You both know when to fight and when to love. A beat. That's important. Not warm, not sentimental, just certain. Soren exhaled slowly. Sir, that's the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. McCormick tapped him once on the shoulder. Then you're keeping the wrong company. And just like that, both men smiled. Back at the library, Moya found Feso in the reading hall near closing time. He was sitting alone at one of the long wooden tables, the book open in front of him. She slowed slightly when she saw him still there. You haven't left yet, she asked softly. Feso looked up. Eventually. She nodded as if accepting the answer more than understanding it. He tapped the open page lightly. I'm only halfway through, but he glanced down at the text again. This book is really about the danger of charisma without character. Moya studied him for a moment. Yes, she said simply. That answer stayed with him longer than it should have. Because, ironically, charisma had carried him through almost every room he'd ever entered. The entire world had rewarded him for it. You like philosophy, she observed. It wasn't a question. Feso leaned back slightly in the chair. I've been a curious child my whole life. That finally made her smile properly, not restrained, not polite, just brief and real. And it did something to him he couldn't immediately name. Before he could overthink it, he blurted out, Wanna have lunch with me tomorrow? Moya looked genuinely surprised. For a moment, she seemed caught somewhere between caution and curiosity. But the warmth rising in her chest answered before fear could. Yes. Simple, quiet, certain, and somehow that felt bigger than if she'd given him a speech. Feso smiled so widely it nearly betrayed all remaining dignity. Moya reached for her card and passed it to him. Wow, he thought to himself, a paper card. Classic. When she handed it to him, their fingers brushed again. This time neither of them looked away immediately. Then Feso stood, suddenly unable to leave the library fast enough, because the world as he knew it had just been turned upside down. Hey loves, this is heating up. Wonder what happens next. Are you Team Moya, Team Feso, or Team both? Leave a note in the comments, and if you haven't already, please subscribe and like. All of this tells YouTube that our content matters. Thanks, and let's get back to the story. The next day at the library, Soren the mayor and Mr. McCormick posed for renovation press photos while Janice, head of communications, directed everyone with the authority of someone who trusted no one to stand correctly on their own. A little closer. No, not like you're announcing a tax increase. Prince Soren, that smile says hostage situation. In the background, Feso sat near the windows with the book Moya had given him, seemingly uninterested in the cameras, which somehow made him more distracting. When the photos wrapped and Soren and Mr. McCormick left the room, the mayor glanced back toward Feso unapologetically. Now that Duke is dangerously fine, she declared. If y'all ever figure out cloning, send a few my way for city morale. Janice burst out laughing. The mayor pointed at her, fingers snapping, something she picked up from Maeve. Don't judge me, she said. Cougars have excellent taste. Janice chuckled. Then the mayor glanced toward Moya, whose face had gone suspiciously coy. Oh, the mayor said slowly. Interesting, seems like you agree with me. Moya immediately looked down at the paperwork in her hands. The mayor grinned. Janice, I'll see you back at City Hall. And with one last amused look toward Feso, she walked out. The second the door shut, Janice turned dramatically toward Moya. Now why are you looking like that, Miss Thing? Don't tell me you think he's fine too. Moya answered with complete sincerity. He is fine. Janice stared at her for half a second before laughing loudly. Oh, you're not that quiet. Moya tried to focus on organizing papers. We're having lunch today. That wiped the smile right off Janice's face. Excuse me. Moya finally looked up. He asked me out yesterday. As long as I've known you, Janice said, you have never voluntarily gone on a date. Moya shrugged lightly. Janice narrowed her eyes immediately. Did you research him? No, Moya, I'm not really on social media. Janice gasped softly. Well, good thing I am. She immediately grabbed her phone and searched his name. At first it looked harmless, photos from galas, fashion campaigns, interviews, then more appeared, tabloid headlines, dating rumors, party photos. Entire social media compilations dedicated to women he'd allegedly charmed across multiple continents. Janice's expression shifted instantly. Oh no! Moya's stomach tightened slightly. Janice turned the screen toward her. This man is professionally handsome and emotionally unsafe. Moya stared silently as more headlines appeared. The Duke who never settles down. Aveleria's favorite heartbreaker. The internet's royal playboy. Janice looked genuinely concerned now. Duke or not, this is elite-level F-boy behavior. Moya looked back toward the reading hall where Feso still sat quietly reading her book, and somehow that made it worse. After a long moment, she nodded once. Not surprising. Around lunchtime, Feso finally walked toward the reference desk. His expression softened immediately when he saw her. Are you ready, gorgeous? Moya looked up slowly. The line sounded different now, too smooth, too practiced, like something he'd probably said to dozens of women before her. I'm sorry, Duke Feso, she said politely. I have too much work today. Please enjoy lunch without me. Then she returned to what she was doing as if the conversation were finished. Feso blinked. Not because someone had canceled on him. That alone was almost historically unprecedented, but because of how completely her energy had changed. Yesterday there had been warmth, curiosity, chemistry. Today there was distance. Controlled, professional distance. He tried again. We could make it quick. I can't. Dinner instead. I'm busy. Every answer was soft and final. Then, before he could regroup enough to charm his way back into control of the situation, Moya gathered a stack of files and disappeared into a private office reserved for staff. The door shut behind her. Locked. And for the first time in years, Feso found himself standing there without the faintest idea what to do next. The next few days became an exercise in complete futility for Feso. So naturally, he returned to the only strategy that had ever worked for him before, his old one. The florist delivered enough arrangements to the library to look like a botanical garden had exploded across Petersburg. Moya had every bouquet removed by noon. The next day, he sent designer dresses from Valentino, Givenchy, Gucci, and Balenciaga. Moya donated every single one to the women's shelter. Then came imported Swiss chocolates and enough Ethiopian coffee to caffeinate half the eastern seaboard. Moya simply called Rosie, now Petersburg's top event planner since Mel had married the prince, and asked her to organize a teacher appreciation gathering for the public school staff. By the end of the week, teachers across Petersburg were drinking luxury coffee while eating truffles they could never normally afford. Feso escalated. Custom diamond jewelry, a Cartier Love bracelet, a David Eweman Cable Classics bangle, front row seats to sold-out Broadway shows. And finally, a puppy. Moya rejected almost everything on principle alone. The implication behind the gifts irritated her more than the gifts themselves, that she could somehow be impressed into affection through excess. But the puppy, that was different. The little Azawak hound from West Africa was all long legs, intelligent eyes, and awkward elegance. Ridiculously expensive, apparently rare, and entirely too adorable for its own good. Moya sat on the floor of her office staring at it suspiciously while it rested its tiny head on her knee like it already belonged there. "This is manipulative," she whispered to the dog. The puppy blinked slowly. She sighed. "Also effective." Back at the ranch, Feso sat slumped in the corner of the living room looking genuinely discouraged for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Grant glanced knowingly at Brianna. She walked over. "Feso," she said carefully, "I don't mean to get in your business, but I heard you basically sent the entire Saks Fifth Avenue to the library." Feso let out a defeated laugh. "She won't talk to me. She won't accept anything I send." "I don't know what to do." Brianna nodded sympathetically. "Well, all those gifts are incredible. Actually, they are beyond incredible." She sat beside him. "But from what I can tell, she liked you, not the Duke." That hit home. Just then, Soren walked into the room carrying a drink. "Exactly," he said. "You can pretty much have anyone you want, but that's the problem." Feso frowned. Soren continued, "You've spent your whole life being impressive based on what was external instead of being known for what's internal." Grant pointed immediately. "Did you make that up? That was deep. Marriage changed you." Soren ignored him. "Strip everything else away," he told Feso. "Be authentic. Be the giant blurred you actually are." That finally pulled a real laugh out of him. Brianna smiled. "There's honestly nothing sexier than authenticity." Right on cue, Grant wrapped his arms around her from behind. "It's how I pulled her." Brianna rolled her eyes while trying not to smile. Feso shook his head laughing before standing slowly. "No more deliveries," he said decisively. "I think it's time I go back to the library." Soren nodded once. "Good." Then, after a beat, "Because we leave for Aveleria tomorrow." Eventually, Feso showed up to the library without anything. No gifts, no persuasion. Just a simple request, tea, and a book reading at the library after closing. Moya hesitated. Feso noticed immediately. "I'm not entirely sure what I did," he admitted carefully, "but I think my reputation may have arrived before I did." A small pause. "And perhaps that's what I deserve." That surprised her. He held up the book she'd given him. "I finished it," he said softly. "There's a passage I'd like to read to you if you'll let me." Moya looked at him, really looked at him. She should absolutely say no. He was charming, dangerous, beautiful in the sort of way that probably ruined people's decision-making regularly, and unfortunately sincere. That was the problem. She inhaled slowly before meeting his eyes directly. "I need to pray on it first," she said quietly. "I'll call you." Feso blinked once. "Pray on it, pray on it." The confidence in her voice made him straighten slightly. "Okay," and that's exactly what she did. She prayed. Then she called Brianna. "You know him better than I do," Moya admitted. "What do you think?" Brianna smiled knowingly on the other end. "Well, he's clearly crazy about you." Then her tone softened. "But honestly, I love that you prayed about this first." A beat. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." Moya closed her eyes briefly. "I know what to do." A few minutes later, she called him. The second Feso answered, she blurted out nervously, "Okay, 5 p.m., before closing, 20 minutes, that's it." The smile that spread across his face could probably be seen from space. "I'll take it." At closing time, Feso arrived carrying the simplest thing he'd brought her all week. Tea. Homemade scones Mrs. Anderson had insisted he not ruin himself. And the book. No jewelry, no flowers, no spectacle. Moya noticed immediately. She quietly led him into the small room where the library hosted book clubs and children's reading hours. The room felt different after hours, softer somehow, private. They sat together. Feso glanced down at the pages before looking up at her. "Do you mind if I read first?" Moya nodded cautiously. "Okay." He took a sip of tea, cleared his throat softly, then read aloud. "Charisma is often mistaken for goodness because both make people feel hopeful for a moment. But character reveals itself in consistency, especially when admiration is no longer being offered." The words settled heavily between them. Then he looked at her. This book made me realize something about myself I wasn't ready to admit. For once, there was no performance in him, no charm, just honesty. My whole life, I've had more attention than I knew what to do with. He gave a small, self-aware laugh, and somehow none of it meant very much. His eyes stayed on hers. Then I met you. Moya felt her heartbeat betray her immediately. You challenge me, he continued quietly. You inspire me. You make me want to become better than the version of myself everyone else seems satisfied with. A pause. I would honestly love the chance to know you properly. His voice softened further. To court you correctly, if you'll allow it. Moya studied him carefully. This globally admired, endlessly photographed man sitting on the floor of a small-town library reading philosophy to her over tea. And somehow this version of him felt more real than all the others. The simplicity of the evening stripped everything else away. No audience, no titles, no performance, just two people reading passages to each other and laughing quietly between pages. And little by little, they both relaxed into something real. When the evening ended, Feso walked her slowly through the darkened library stacks. No pressure, no rushing, just closeness. Near the front doors, he stopped. His eyes dropped briefly to her lips before lifting back to hers. I leave tomorrow, he said quietly. But if you agree, and I really hope you do, this cannot be the last time we share tea and books together. Moya smiled softly, and suddenly he looked nervous again. Can I kiss you? Moya, never the type to speak needlessly, answered by grabbing the front of his shirt and pulling him down to her. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, warmer, everything they'd been trying not to say finally finding somewhere to go. A tiny whining sound interrupted them. Moya pulled back breathlessly. Standing beside them was the puppy, having apparently escaped his crate in search of her. Moya laughed immediately, scooping the cutie into her arms. The puppy curled happily against Moya's chest. She looked up at Feso with a smile he already knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. What did you name her? He asked. Moya looked down at the puppy thoughtfully. Charisma, she said calmly. Of course. And with that, Feso burst into laughter. Real laughter. The kind that caught him off guard. Moya hugged the puppy closer and whispered, Best gift ever. The next morning, the royal squad was packed and preparing to leave Petersburg. Mrs. Anderson made absolutely certain nobody left hungry, personally insulting anyone who tried to claim they were full. Ibrahim rubbed Pancake's belly what seemed to be an eternity. Feso told Soren he'd be back within the hour. Soren narrowed his eyes knowingly. Sure, you will. When Feso arrived at the library, Moya's entire face softened at the sight of him. Bittersweet. That was the only word for it. He kissed her quickly the second he reached her, careful enough to behave in public but clearly struggling to remember why he should. There's someone I'd like you to meet, he said. Before she could ask questions, he disappeared again. A few minutes later, the front doors opened, and walking beside Feso was Taji Saladin, the author. The man whose writing had quietly altered both of their lives. No announcement, no press release, no spectacle, just a quiet surprise signing inside the library. People had already begun lining up outside. Moya stood frozen in complete disbelief. Feso had somehow arranged the entire thing privately with Janice and Mr. McCormick. And for the first time, Moya saw something that could not be reduced to charm, wealth, or reputation. Effort, thoughtfulness, follow-through, character. Eventually, Soren, Musa, and Ibrahim practically had to drag Feso out of Petersburg. Soren looked personally offended. This is ironic, he complained, because I had to drag you on this trip. Everyone climbed into the SUV, just as Feso reached for the door. Wait. Moya's voice echoed across the parking lot loud enough to surprise everyone, including herself. Feso turned immediately. She stopped a few feet away, slightly breathless. I just wanted to say thank you. Feso smiled softly. You can thank me by visiting Aveleria. Moya smiled, one day. And somehow, that sounded less like a maybe and more like a promise. Feso got into the SUV, still smiling. They took the jet. Soren couldn't wait any longer to be reunited with his bride. The royal squad returned to the castle together. The moment the doors opened, surprise! Hundreds of voices erupted through the halls. It was Soren's birthday. And between royal responsibilities, renovations, travel, and chaos, even he had nearly forgotten. Mel ran straight toward him. Soren immediately lifted his wife into his arms and kissed her so long and dramatically that several guests looked away out of respect for public decency, including the king and queen. "A surprise birthday celebration?" Soren asked breathlessly. "That's what you've been secretly working on." Mel nodded mischievously, Ingrid cheesing from behind. The ballroom exploded with music, laughter, staff members, political allies, and nearly every couple who had somehow found love in Petersburg. Grant and Brianna laughed near the dance floor. Maeve and Tay Kim chased toddler Yoon, who was running through the palace like royalty without supervision. Serious and beautiful as ever were Medina and Minjae. Janice and Rowan were already documenting everything with cameras. Rosie and Edward coordinated the event like military strategists, and tucked away together in one corner were Mimi and Juwon. A few moments later, Juwon took the stage and performed his now chart-topping song, "I Pulled You In," the same song he'd once publicly dedicated to Mimi on a New Year's Eve stage in LA, and yes, Mimi cried, but she also danced on him because that's what she did. Hey loves, if you haven't heard all the love stories of these couples, or maybe you've heard only a few, make sure you check out the playlist below. Because honestly, there's nothing quite like an intoxicating meet-cute, and every single one of these stories has one. But let's get back to this one. As Juwon performed, his eyes locked on Mimi across the ballroom, the palace doors opened again. Moya stepped inside quietly. Feso looked up and completely forgot every ounce of royal composure he'd ever learned. He flew across the room and kissed the introverted librarian in front of everyone. The crowd erupted. Juwon paused mid-song just long enough to grin knowingly into the microphone. "I know what that feels like." The entire room laughed. Mimi finger clapped. Soren watched all of it with complete joy while shaking his head at Grant and Brianna, who somehow had managed to keep the entire birthday celebration secret and had flown Moya out. For once in his life, Soren had no speech prepared. No royal response, just gratitude. By Christmas, the library reopened with a full civic celebration. The mayor beamed proudly. Mr. McCormick tried not to. Mel, Soren, Brianna, and Grant all stood nearby admiring the finished renovation they'd worked so hard to complete. And at the center of it all stood Moya. Not loudly, not performatively, but fully recognized now for what she had always been, the heart of the library. Feso stood beside her, not as royalty, not as a guest, but as someone who simply belonged there. No grand gestures this time, just presence. When the celebration ended, he quietly led her toward a secluded corner between the shelves, the same library where everything had started. And there, surrounded by books and Christmas lights, with Charisma wagging her tail, Feso proposed, and Moya said yes, because somewhere between tea, philosophy, and a borrowed book, Feso had realized something undeniable. He never wanted to build a life that did not include her. Two people who found each other quietly in the margins of life finally stepped into the center of their own story. And as they kissed, soft, certain, completely at peace, the library no longer felt like just a building. It felt like home. This has been Christmas in Old Towne, where ambitious women, unexpected love, and holiday spirit collide. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And if you're new here, oh, you've got some catching up to do. Because in Petersburg, the mayor's inner circle is full of brilliant, dynamic women. And somehow, every single one of them finds love at Christmas. Be blessed. And have a very merry everything.